is Jason. I was 36 years old when this happened. At the time, I was going through a difficult divorce and needed to start over almost from scratch. I ended up renting a small house in rural Kentucky, in a countryside area near a town that barely appeared on maps. The house was simple, old, and surrounded by a lot of vegetation. The rent was cheap, and I needed a quiet place to reorganize my life. The only companion I brought with me was my German Shepherd named Rex. I had owned him for nearly 6 years, and he had always been an extremely well-balanced dog. He wasn't aggressive, didn't bark without reason, and usually ignored normal neighborhood sounds completely. That's why, when he started acting strangely during the very first week in the new house, I noticed immediately that something was different. At the time, however, I assumed it was simply an adjustment to the new environment. After all, everything was new for both of us. The house, the smells, the sounds of the woods, and a completely different routine from the one we had before. Behind the property was a relatively dense wooded area. It wasn't a huge forest, but there were enough trees to completely block visibility after a few yards. During the day, it didn't bother me. In fact, it was one of the reasons I liked the house. The place was quiet and isolated. The problem began during the nights. Almost every night I would wake up and find Rex sitting in front of the living room window. Not lying down, not resting, sitting completely motionless, staring into the darkness behind the house. The first few times I thought it was curious. Then I started paying closer attention. The behavior repeated itself at the same time every night. Usually between 1 and 3 in the morning. I would get up to drink water or use the bathroom and find Rex in the same position, staring at exactly the same spot in the woods. When I called him, he obeyed normally, but a few minutes later, he would return to the window. The strangest part was that he never growled or barked. He simply watched, as if he were monitoring something in the distance that I couldn't see. After a few days, I began checking the area every time I found Rex in that position. I would turn on the porch light, look through the window, and sometimes even walk out into the yard. I never saw anything. There were no visible animals, no people walking through the woods, no unusual sounds beyond the normal noises of insects, wind, and branches moving. Even so, Rex kept returning to that same window night after night. What bothered me most was the intensity of his attention. Anyone who has owned a German Shepherd knows the difference between curiosity and genuine focus. This was clearly the second one. At one point, I began wondering whether a deer or some other animal regularly appeared in the woods during the night. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. But then I noticed another strange detail. Whenever Rex watched the woods, his ears remained upright and pointed forward, as if he were tracking specific movements. Sometimes he would slightly change the angle of his head, following something that seemed to be moving between the trees. I looked in the same direction and couldn't see absolutely anything. About a week after moving in, I woke up around 2 in the morning and found Rex at the window again. That night there was less moonlight than usual, and the woods looked like a dark wall behind the property. Maybe because of accumulated exhaustion or frustration from not understanding his behavior, I finally decided to inspect the area more carefully. I grabbed a powerful flashlight that I kept in the garage and went out through the back door. Rex immediately became alert when he realized what I was doing. I walked across the yard, illuminating the nearest trees while feeling the cold air typical of that time of year. The ground behind the house was relatively flat and covered with dry leaves. As I moved a few yards closer to the woods, I swept the flashlight back and forth. That's when something reflected the light among the trees. At first, I thought it was some object left behind by previous residents. But as I got closer, I clearly saw what it was: a folding chair. One of those simple chairs used for fishing or camping. It was positioned facing my house. I stopped immediately in front of the chair and stared at it for several seconds. It didn't make any sense. The area behind the house wasn't used as a trail, and there was no lake, river, or point of interest nearby that would justify someone leaving a chair there. What bothered me even more was its exact position. It wasn't simply abandoned among the trees. It was aimed directly at the back of my house. More specifically, at the living room window where Rex usually sat every night. I shined the flashlight on the ground around it and found several marks in the damp soil. They weren't perfectly defined footprints, but there were clear signs that someone had recently been moving around the area. I also found several empty snack wrappers and a partially crushed water bottle hidden behind a nearby tree trunk. The feeling I had at that moment was difficult to describe. I was still trying to find a rational explanation, Maybe some teenager had used the area to hang out or drink. Maybe a hunter had temporarily stopped there. But the more I looked at that chair facing my house, the less convinced I became by those possibilities. I quickly returned to the yard carrying the chair with me. Rex was waiting by the back door and seemed much more agitated than usual. I went inside, locked every door, and walked to the living room window. That's when I realized something that immediately made me uncomfortable. From that spot in the woods, it was possible to see almost the entire living room through the main window. During the day, I usually kept the curtains open because I liked the natural light entering the house. That meant anyone sitting in that chair would have a perfect view of my routine. They could see when I watched television, when I worked on my computer, and even when I got up during the night. As I made that connection, a chill ran through my body. Rex remained standing at the glass, staring into the darkness outside. I followed his gaze and tried to see beyond the reflection of the room. I didn't see anyone, but for the first time, I seriously began to consider that my dog might not have been watching animals or random movements in the woods. Maybe he was watching a person, someone who regularly appeared behind the property when they believed no one was paying attention. That night I barely slept. I kept the curtains closed, left the outdoor lights on, and watched the area through small gaps in the fabric whenever I woke up. Nothing happened until sunrise. The next day I took photographs of the chair, the wrappers, and the marks I had found in the woods. I also spoke with a neighbor who lived a few properties away. When I mentioned the chair hidden among the trees, he seemed genuinely surprised. According to him, nobody regularly used that section of the woods. The area was private property, and there were no official trails passing through it. That conversation made me even more uncomfortable. For the rest of the day, I tried convincing myself that everything had been some strange coincidence. But when night came, Rex returned to the same window, exactly as he had done since the first day. This time I sat beside him for almost an hour watching the woods. The dog remained completely focused on a specific spot among the trees. At one point, his ears perked up even more and his body became rigid. I immediately followed the direction of his gaze. For a second, I thought I saw movement in the darkness, something retreating between the tree trunks as soon as the porch light illuminated that area. That was enough for me. I grabbed my phone and called the county sheriff's office the following morning. A deputy came to the property later that day and searched the wooded area with me. He found several signs of human presence near where the chair had been positioned, but nothing that could identify who had been there. No trail cameras in the area captured anything useful, and nobody ever came forward to claim the chair. I continued living in that house for several more months before moving away because of work. During that time, Rex never completely abandoned the habit of watching that window. Some nights he seemed calm. Other nights he would stare into the woods for hours. Maybe I'll never know exactly who was watching my house or how long it had been happening before I arrived. What still bothers me is remembering the position of that chair. It wasn't facing the road. It wasn't pointed toward a trail or a scenic view. It was aimed precisely at the only window through which someone could observe most of the living room. And looking back, I have the feeling that Rex noticed that person's presence long before I found any evidence that they actually existed. Story 2. My name is Megan. I was 17 years old when this happened. For much of my teenage years, I used to spend a few days of my school vacations helping my grandparents on their farm, which was located in a very isolated area of rural Nebraska. The place was far from any major town and surrounded by miles of farmland and pasture. I always enjoyed going there because it was a complete change from my normal routine. My grandparents raised a few animals, grew some of their own food, and lived a very quiet life. That summer, I brought along my hunting dog, Cooper. He was a black Labrador, extremely obedient and well accustomed to rural environments. Cooper spent entire days following me around the property without causing any problems. That's why, when he started acting strangely one particular night, I immediately knew that something was different. To this day, I consider it one of the most frightening experiences I've ever had. The farm had several barns and old structures scattered across the property. One of them was an abandoned barn located a few hundred yards from the main house. According to my grandfather, the building hadn't been used in many years. The roof needed repairs, the electrical system had been removed, and there was practically no reason for anyone to go inside. That night, I was sitting on the back porch talking with my grandfather after dinner. The weather was pleasant and the countryside was extremely quiet. Cooper was lying near the steps when he suddenly lifted his head and became completely alert. A few seconds later, he started barking toward the barn, At first, nobody paid much attention. Dogs often react to wild animals in rural areas, but the barking continued, and it became more intense. Cooper wasn't running back and forth the way he normally did when he spotted rabbits or deer. He remained standing still, staring directly at the barn while barking nonstop. My grandfather noticed it immediately and commented that he had never seen the dog act that way since I had arrived. After nearly 10 minutes of continuous barking, my grandfather decided to find out what was going on. He was an extremely calm person and rarely worried about noises coming from the property. Because of that, when he got up from his chair and grabbed a flashlight, I realized that he also thought the situation was strange. Cooper immediately ran ahead as soon as he saw my grandfather walking toward the barn. I followed them. The distance wasn't huge, but it was enough for the house to disappear partially behind trees and farm equipment scattered across the property. As we approached the structure, Cooper's behavior changed. He stopped barking for a few seconds and began walking slowly around the barn with his nose close to the ground. The silence that settled over the place at that moment made me uncomfortable. The wind had died down, and there were almost no sounds coming from the fields. The only things I could hear were our footsteps on the dry ground and the dog's heavy breathing as he moved around near the walls of the building. When we reached the main entrance, my grandfather shined his flashlight inside. The barn was dark and appeared to be empty. There were old tools, rusted shelves, and pieces of farm equipment that hadn't been used in years. At first, everything seemed normal. Then Cooper began sniffing an area near the back wall. My grandfather pointed the flashlight toward the ground, and we immediately noticed something out of place. There were fresh marks in the accumulated dust, not just isolated footprints. They looked like paths created by repeated traffic over the previous several days. We also found a relatively new plastic bottle behind some boxes and an empty food wrapper that clearly hadn't been there for very long. That caught our attention because nobody in the family used that barn. My grandfather stood silently studying the signs for several seconds. I remember seeing him examining the marks on the floor with an expression I had rarely seen on his face. For the first time that night, I had the genuine feeling that someone might have been entering the building without my grandparents' knowledge. We continued looking around more carefully. As the flashlight beam moved across the barn, other details began to appear that we hadn't noticed at first. Behind a stack of old boxes was a folded blanket. In another corner, we found several empty soda cans and a modern flashlight resting on a shelf. None of those things belonged to my grandparents. Cooper remained extremely alert. The dog moved slowly through the barn, sniffing different areas and occasionally looking toward the darker sections of the building. My grandfather began to look visibly concerned. He commented that someone was probably using the structure without permission. Maybe a hunter, someone seeking temporary shelter, or even a homeless person passing through the area. All of those explanations seemed reasonable. The problem was that the property was far from any major road. It wasn't the kind of place where someone would simply end up by accident. While we were examining the items left behind, I thought I heard a faint crack from outside. I immediately looked toward the main entrance, but I saw nothing except the darkness of the night. Then something happened that completely changed the atmosphere. We heard a door slam, not a bang caused by the wind. The sound was loud, quick, and clearly produced by someone closing one of the side doors of the barn. Both my grandfather and I turned instantly. Cooper immediately began growling. The sound had come from an area at the back of the structure, where there was a smaller exit that had once been used for farm equipment. My grandfather pointed the flashlight in that direction, and we realized the door was closed. The disturbing detail was that it had been open when we entered. I remembered that because moonlight had been partially shining through the opening a few minutes earlier. For several seconds, nobody said a word. The barn felt much quieter now. Then I realized something else. If someone had closed that door, it meant another person was there with us or very close to the building at that exact moment. The thought alone made my heart race. Cooper was no longer merely alert. He stood motionless, staring into the darkness at the back of the barn while producing a low growl I had never heard before. My grandfather immediately told me to stay behind him. Although he was trying to remain calm, I could tell from his voice that he was worried too. He gripped the flashlight more firmly and slowly began walking toward the door that had closed. Cooper followed us but never took his eyes off the dark area surrounding the back walls. The barn seemed much larger at that moment than it really was. Every dark corner appeared to be hiding something. As we moved forward, I heard another sound. This time it was something being quickly dragged across the wooden floor above us. I froze instantly. There was a small old loft above part of the structure that had been used decades earlier to store hay. My grandfather immediately shined the flashlight in that direction. We didn't see anyone, but the sound had been real. We had both heard it. Cooper reacted too, lifting his head and fixing his gaze on that area. For several seconds we stood completely still, trying to hear any additional movement. Then the silence returned. The feeling that we were being watched became so strong that I wanted nothing more than to run back to the house. My grandfather finally decided that he had seen enough. He said we were leaving and would call the sheriff the next morning to investigate the situation. Neither of us had any interest in confronting whoever was using the barn. We started walking back toward the main entrance. That's when we heard footsteps. They weren't coming from outside. They weren't coming from the loft. They seemed to be coming from somewhere behind the piles of boxes and abandoned equipment at the back of the building. They were quick but cautious footsteps, like someone trying to move without making much noise. Cooper began barking violently and lunged several feet in that direction before my grandfather grabbed his leash. The sound of the footsteps immediately sped up. A moment later, we heard a metallic bang followed by the sound of a door opening. Whoever had been hiding there had just found a way out of the barn. My grandfather pointed the flashlight toward the area where the noise had come from, but all he managed to illuminate was dust hanging in the air and an opening partially hidden behind old equipment. The person had already disappeared before we could see them. We left the barn as quickly as possible and returned to the main house without attempting to follow whoever had fled. My grandfather locked all the doors, checked the windows, and called a neighbor who lived relatively nearby to inform him about what had happened. Neither of us slept much that night. Cooper remained restless for hours, moving from one window to another and occasionally staring toward the fields near the barn. The next morning, my grandfather contacted the county sheriff's office. A deputy came to the property before lunchtime. Together they returned to the barn to examine it more carefully. I accompanied them during the inspection. That's when we discovered something that explained at least part of the situation. Behind the old boxes was a hidden space that was relatively protected from the wind and rain. Inside they found blankets, food wrappers, water bottles, and several personal belongings. Someone really had been using the barn as a shelter. The problem was that nobody knew who that person was, and there was no indication of how long they had been staying there. Story 3. My name is Laura. I was 38 years old when this happened, and I lived alone on a small rural property outside Cookeville, Tennessee. After years of living in busier areas, I had chosen that place specifically for the peace and quiet. My house sat back from the main road, surrounded by trees and a few open fields. The nearest neighbor lived several minutes away on foot. Despite the isolation, I always felt safe there. My main companion was a yellow Labrador named Molly. I had raised her since she was a puppy, and honestly, she was one of the friendliest dogs I had ever known. Molly loved people. Delivery drivers, neighbors, occasional visitors, it didn't matter who they were. She normally greeted everyone with a wagging tail and a desire for attention. That's why, when she started behaving in a way I had never seen before, I immediately knew something was wrong. This happened on a rainy night in October 2021, during a storm that had already been going on for several hours. That night, I was alone in the living room watching television while rain constantly struck the windows. The wind was strong enough to make the tree branches sway around the house. Molly was lying near the couch, apparently relaxed. Around 9:30 p.m., I heard a knock at the front door. That immediately surprised me. Almost nobody ever came to my property without warning, especially during a storm. Molly lifted her head at the exact same moment. I walked toward the entrance thinking it might be a neighbor having trouble because of the bad weather. Before I even reached the door, however, I noticed something strange. Molly ran ahead of me and positioned herself directly in front of the entrance. The hair along her back was standing up. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the porch completely soaked by the rain. He appeared to be somewhere between 40 and 50 years old and was wearing a drenched, dark jacket. As soon as he noticed movement inside the house, he explained that his car had broken down on a nearby road and asked if he could use a phone to call for help. The request sounded reasonable. The problem was that at that exact moment, Molly began to growl. That immediately made me uncomfortable. In all the years I had owned Molly, I could count on one hand the number of times I had heard her growl at someone. Even on those rare occasions, the behavior had never been this intense. She remained rigid in front of the door, staring directly at the man outside. The growl was low, continuous, and clearly defensive. I tried calming her by calling her name, but she didn't take her attention off him for even a second. Meanwhile, the man kept speaking through the closed door. He repeated that he only needed to make a quick call and that his car was parked on the main road. Something about the situation began to feel strange. From the front of the house, it was possible to see part of the driveway leading to the property. I hadn't seen headlights or heard any vehicle approach in the previous several minutes. Besides, almost everyone in the area had a cell phone. It wasn't impossible that someone genuinely needed help. But I started wondering why this person had walked to an isolated house in the middle of a storm instead of looking for a gas station or a more populated area. Even so, I tried to respond politely. Through the door, I told him that I wasn't comfortable opening it at night, but that I could call roadside assistance or the police if he needed help. There were a few seconds of silence on the other side. Then the man replied that it wouldn't be necessary and thanked me. The conversation ended abruptly. I looked through the peephole again and saw him walking down the porch steps toward the darkness. I waited until he disappeared from view. Only then did I begin to relax slightly. Molly, however, did not relax. She remained standing by the door for several minutes. Then she quickly walked to another part of the house. I thought that was strange and followed her down the hallway. The dog went directly to the kitchen, where a window overlooked the backyard. When I arrived and slightly pulled back the curtain, my stomach dropped. The same man was silently crossing the backyard. He wasn't walking toward the road. He wasn't looking for help. He was moving along the side of the house, using the darkness and the rain to stay out of sight from the front entrance. I stood completely still for several seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. The man didn't appear lost. He didn't seem like someone looking for shelter from the rain either. His movements were cautious and deliberate. He walked near the fence and the trees, avoiding the more illuminated areas. The only reason I could see him at all was because the kitchen light reflected partially off the rain. My heart immediately began to race. I stepped away from the window without making any noise and instinctively turned off the kitchen lights. Molly continued watching the yard and was now producing that same low growl I had heard at the front door. I grabbed my phone and began dialing the police. While the call connected, I quietly moved to another window located in the laundry room. From there, I could see a different section of the property. The man had moved several yards farther. Now he was near the back of the house. What frightened me most was the fact that he wasn't running or acting like someone unfamiliar with the property. He seemed to be calmly evaluating the house, as if searching for a way to approach without being noticed. The emergency dispatcher answered, and I began explaining the situation as quickly as possible. While speaking, I continued watching through small gaps in the curtains. At one point, I completely lost sight of the man. That was worse than seeing him. Now I had no idea where he was. The rain continued pouring heavily, and the sound of water striking the roof made it difficult to hear anything outside. That was when Molly ran to the back door. The dog began barking aggressively, something that was extremely unusual for her. I hurried into the hallway and saw that she was staring directly at the small window built into the door. I approached carefully and looked through the glass. For a brief moment, I could make out a silhouette moving alongside the house. The man was much closer than I had realized. He wasn't trying to return to the road. He was circling the house. The dispatcher instructed me to remain inside and informed me that a patrol car was already on the way. Meanwhile, I locked all the doors again, turned off several lights, and stayed away from the main windows while trying to track his movements without revealing exactly where I was. The next several minutes felt much longer than they actually were. I remained in the living room holding my phone while Molly patrolled the house from one window to another. Whenever she stopped at a specific spot, I tried to discreetly observe the same area. At one point, I heard a sound coming from the side of the house. It sounded like someone stepping on the gravel surrounding part of the foundation. Then I heard another noise near one of the guest bedroom windows. It wasn't an obvious attempt to break in. It sounded more like someone checking the house, testing possibilities. That frightened me far more than impulsive behavior would have. The person outside seemed calm, methodical. In a moment of courage that was probably driven more by fear than anything else, I quickly looked through a small opening in the living room curtain. I saw him again. He was standing near a tree at the back of the property, watching the house. He made no effort to seek help. He wasn't using a phone. He wasn't trying to signal drivers on the road. He was simply watching. When Molly started barking in his direction, he immediately backed away into the darkness among the trees. About 10 minutes later, I finally saw the lights of a patrol car reflecting through the rain. I had never felt so relieved to see a police vehicle. As soon as the headlights illuminated the entrance to the property, the figure disappeared completely. The officers searched the property, the nearby fields, and the main road. They found no one. They also found no disabled vehicle nearby. When I explained what had happened, one of the officers made a comment that stayed with me. He said that if the man had truly needed help, he would have accepted when I offered to call roadside assistance or emergency services. Instead, he ended the conversation and went directly to the back of the house. That was difficult to explain as a simple request for help. They never discovered who he was or what he intended to do that night. But there is one thing I remain convinced of. If Molly had reacted the way she normally reacted to strangers, I probably would have opened the door without thinking twice. She had never shown that level of aggression before, and she never showed it again afterward. To this day, I believe my dog sensed something about that man long before I saw him silently moving through the yard trying to get closer to the house. Story 4. My name is Tyler. I was 26 years old when this happened, and I lived outside Missoula, Montana. I had always enjoyed outdoor activities and spent much of my weekends hiking in the forest reserves throughout the region. At the time, my constant companion was a Siberian husky named Coda. I took him on practically every hike because he was an extremely active dog and accustomed to long distances. On top of that, he was very observant. He had alerted me to wildlife more than once during remote hikes. What happened that afternoon took place in a relatively little-used reserve located about 40 minutes from the city. I already knew the area well because I had hiked those trails several times over the previous years. That is precisely why what happened caught my attention so strongly. It was a quiet place, rarely crowded, and usually visited only by a few local hikers. It was not the kind of trail where you expected to run into problems. I arrived at the reserve in the middle of the afternoon. The weather was pleasant and the sky was partly cloudy. There were only 3 vehicles in the parking lot when I arrived. I passed a few people during the first miles of the hike, but as I moved into the more remote sections of the trail, all foot traffic disappeared completely. That was normal for that area. Coda seemed relaxed and excited as always. He would run a few yards ahead, come back to walk beside me, and occasionally stop to sniff something near the trail. Toward the late afternoon, when the sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains, I heard a sound coming from the forest. It was a whistle. It did not sound like a bird call or a noise made by the wind. It clearly sounded like a person whistling somewhere in the distance. I did not think much of it at the time. Trails are public places and other people are often scattered throughout the woods. I continued walking normally. A few minutes later, however, Coda stopped in the middle of the trail and looked behind us. His ears were upright, and he seemed completely focused on something far away among the trees. I called Coda and he resumed walking normally. I assumed he had heard an animal or noticed movement in the woods. But about 5 minutes later, the whistle came again. It was the exact same sound. Short, simple, and distant. This time I heard it more clearly because the wind had died down. Immediately, Coda repeated the same behavior. He stopped in the middle of the trail, turned his head behind us, and stared toward the direction from which the sound seemed to have come. I stood quietly, trying to listen more carefully. I heard no footsteps and no voices, only that isolated whistle. I continued hiking, but I started paying closer attention to my surroundings. As the light faded, the forest became quieter. At that point, I did not feel as though I was being followed, but something about the repetition of that sound began to bother me. Over the next 40 minutes, I heard the whistle at least 4 times. Always distant, always brief, and every single time, Coda reacted exactly the same way. At one point, I even turned around and visually scanned the trail behind me for dozens of yards. I saw no one, no hikers, no cyclists, no sign of movement among the trees. Since it was getting late, I decided to start heading back toward the parking lot. The return hike should have taken a little over an hour. For much of the walk back, the whistling disappeared. That helped me relax a little. Maybe it really was just another visitor in the reserve. Maybe someone was trying to call a dog or communicate with a friend on another part of the trail. But when I was approximately 15 minutes from the parking lot, the sound returned. This time it seemed closer, not very close, just close enough that I immediately noticed the difference. Coda noticed it too. The dog stopped so abruptly that the leash went tight. He stood staring into the forest to the left of the trail while letting out a low whine, something he rarely did. That was enough to make me pick up my pace. I did not run, but I started walking faster. The sun had almost completely disappeared and the natural light was fading by the minute. I just wanted to reach the parking lot and head home. The problem was that when I finally reached the end of the trail, I found something that made me completely forget about the whistling for a few seconds. My car was unlocked. I am absolutely certain I had locked it when I arrived. I am the kind of person who always checks twice before leaving a vehicle in an isolated parking area. Yet when I pulled on the driver's door handle, it opened immediately. I stopped right there. My first thought was that maybe I was confusing that day with another hike. But the more I tried to convince myself of that explanation, the less I believed it. I quickly looked inside the vehicle. Nothing seemed out of place. My emergency backpack was still behind the seat. Several items I had left in the center console remained exactly where I had placed them. Even so, the feeling of unease returned immediately. I checked the rest of the vehicle and found no obvious signs of forced entry. That was when I heard the whistle again. This time it was not coming from the main trail. It seemed to be coming from the forest behind the parking lot. The sound was identical to the others. Short, simple, deliberate. Coda immediately raised his head and stared in the same direction. I stood beside the car trying to locate the source of the sound. The parking lot was nearly empty now. Only 2 vehicles remained besides mine. No people were visible. The sky was darkening rapidly and the trees already formed a dark wall in nearly every direction. The whistle did not come again right away. Instead, silence settled over the area for several seconds. That was when I got the feeling that someone was watching me. I cannot explain exactly why. Maybe it was the combination of the unlocked car, Coda's behavior, and that sound that had followed us throughout the hike. Instinctively, I looked back toward the trail entrance I had just come from. At first, I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted to the fading evening light. Between 2 trees, several yards inside the forest, a figure was standing. It was not walking. It was not hiding. It was simply standing there, watching directly toward the area where I was. For several seconds, I stood completely still, staring at the figure. The distance and lighting made it impossible to make out facial features or clothing details. I could only tell clearly that it was an adult person standing among the trees. What disturbed me most was the fact that the figure showed no reaction after realizing it had been seen. Normally, someone would wave, step onto the trail, or simply continue walking. This person did none of those things. They simply remained there watching. Coda was focused on exactly the same spot. The dog became rigid and began producing a low growl that I rarely heard from him. That was enough to convince me that I did not want to remain there trying to understand the situation. I quickly got into the car and locked the doors. Before starting the engine, I looked one more time toward the trail entrance. The figure was still there, motionless. The feeling was incredibly strange because it seemed less like someone preparing to begin a hike and more like someone observing who entered and left the forest. I immediately started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. As I maneuvered toward the main road, I looked one last time in the rearview mirror. The figure was still standing among the trees. It did not approach. It did not try to follow my vehicle. It simply remained watching until it disappeared from sight as I drove away. During the drive home, I tried to find a logical explanation for everything. Maybe it was just another hiker. Maybe someone was using the forest to observe wildlife and did not want to be disturbed. Maybe leaving my car unlocked had simply been my own mistake. But there is one detail I have never been able to ignore. A few days later, I returned to the same reserve with a friend and mentioned the incident to a local park ranger. When I described approximately where I had heard the whistling, he commented that other visitors had reported similar situations over the previous several months. People hearing repeated whistles in less traveled areas of the trail and noticing individuals watching hikers from a distance. No criminal incidents had ever been reported, and no one had been officially identified. Even so, ever since that day, whenever I'm hiking with Coda and he suddenly stops to watch something behind us, I remember that motionless figure among the trees and the whistle that seemed to follow us through the forest during the entire walk back. Story 5. My name is Brandon. I was 34 years old when this happened. My wife Emily and I had always enjoyed camping during the warmer months of the year. Whenever we managed to get a few days off, we looked for more isolated areas to escape the crowds and noise of the cities. That summer, We decided to spend a weekend near a remote lake in northern Wisconsin. It was a region known for having very few campers outside of holiday weekends and plenty of forest surrounding it. We also brought our dog, a Labrador mix named Scout. He was extremely active and loved any opportunity to run freely in open areas. We had taken dozens of similar trips with him and had never experienced any problems. What happened on that trip started so ordinarily that, looking back, it is difficult to believe how much the situation changed over the course of just a few hours. We arrived at the site on a Friday afternoon. The lake was beautiful, surrounded by forest on nearly every side. There were only a few campsites scattered along the shoreline, and only 2 of them appeared to be occupied when we arrived. We set up our tent in a relatively isolated area with a direct view of the water. After organizing our gear, we spent some time walking nearby trails while Scout explored everything around us. The dog normally stayed within sight, but at certain moments he would disappear into the trees for a few minutes before returning. That was not unusual. He always came back when called. Late in the afternoon, while we were walking along a trail near the shoreline, I realized that Scout had disappeared again. We called for him a few times and continued walking slowly. About 5 minutes later, he reappeared from a denser section of the forest. The first thing that caught my attention was the condition he was in. His paws, chest, and part of his muzzle were covered in damp soil. It looked like he had spent several minutes digging somewhere. At first, we did not think much of it. Dogs love to dig, especially in places filled with unfamiliar scents. Emily even joked that Scout had probably found a squirrel or buried an important stick somewhere. We continued our walk normally and returned to camp shortly before sunset. While we were preparing dinner, Scout seemed restless. Instead of lying down near the tent the way he usually did after long hikes, he kept pacing around the campsite. At one point, he began intensely sniffing an area near the edge of the woods just a few yards from our campsite. I assumed he had found food left behind by other campers. But then he started digging. This was not casual digging. Scout dug with an intensity I had never seen before. Dirt and dry leaves flew behind him as he dug deeper and deeper into the ground. I tried calling him several times, but he completely ignored my commands. That alone was unusual because he normally obeyed immediately whenever I used a firmer tone. After a few minutes, I decided to see what had captured the dog's attention so completely. Emily and I walked over while Scout continued digging. When I looked into the hole he had opened, I noticed something partially exposed beneath the soil. At first, I thought it was old trash, but when I pulled the object out, I saw that it was a wallet, not a wallet that had deteriorated with age. It looked relatively new. The leather was still in good condition and showed no signs of having been buried for years. That immediately confused us. I continued clearing away some dirt with my hands and soon found other items. There was a set of keys, a portable charger, and part of a torn backpack. All of the objects looked recent. They did not appear to be things that had been abandoned for months or years. Emily and I looked at each other, unsure what to think. None of those items made sense in that location. And the more Scout dug, the more obvious it became that something larger than ordinary litter was buried beneath the surface. For several minutes, we tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe someone had buried stolen property. Maybe it was simply equipment discarded by an irresponsible visitor. But the more we examined the items, the less convincing those explanations seemed. The wallet still contained cards. The portable charger was not broken. The keys appeared to belong to a modern vehicle. It made no sense for someone to bury all of those things in such an isolated area. Emily suggested that we stop digging and notify the park staff the following day. I immediately agreed. We did not want to destroy potential evidence of something without knowing exactly what we were dealing with. That was when Scout stopped digging on his own. The dog lifted his head and became completely still. For several seconds, he stared across the lake. His behavior caught my attention because it was very similar to how he reacted whenever he noticed people or animals in the distance. I followed his gaze and looked toward the opposite shore. At first, I saw nothing. The evening light was already fading, and much of the forest surrounding the lake was blending into dark shadows. Then I noticed a small orange glow appearing among the trees. A few seconds later, the glow appeared again. It was the tip of a cigarette being inhaled. I kept watching until I saw a thin column of smoke rising above the vegetation. Someone was standing on the opposite shore. The distance was too great to make out any details, but it was possible to clearly see a motionless silhouette near the water. What made me uncomfortable was not simply the person's presence. It was the feeling that they had been there for quite some time. The figure was not walking along the shoreline. They were not fishing. They were not setting up camp. They were simply standing there staring toward the lake. More specifically, they appeared to be looking toward the area where we were kneeling, examining the newly unearthed objects. The feeling of unease appeared immediately. Emily noticed the same thing and asked who the person was. I had no answer. But for the first time since finding the buried objects, I began to feel that maybe we had uncovered something someone did not want found. We continued watching the opposite shoreline for several minutes. The figure remained almost completely motionless. The glow of the cigarette appeared occasionally and then vanished again. The distance made it impossible to know whether the person was actually watching us or simply standing there looking across the lake. Even so, the discomfort grew with every passing minute. Emily suggested that we return to the tent and stop handling the objects. I agreed immediately. We pushed some of the dirt back over the hole without completely covering it and returned to camp with Scout. The dog remained restless. Instead of lying down the way he normally did after a day outdoors, he sat staring alternately toward the woods and the water. While we prepared a simple meal, I continued discreetly watching the opposite shore. The figure was still there. What caught my attention was that even after darkness deepened, the glow of the cigarette continued appearing in exactly the same spot. It was as though that person had no intention of leaving. About half an hour later, something happened that made the situation feel much more serious. I was using a flashlight to organize some equipment when I accidentally illuminated the area where we had found the buried items. That was when I noticed something new on the ground. There were footprints. They were not ours. The tracks began near the edge of the woods and led toward the hole Scout had dug. The disturbing detail was that they appeared recent. The soil was still damp and the edges of the prints were sharply defined. Someone had been there not long before we arrived. I showed the tracks to Emily, and we immediately decided that we were not spending another night in that location. Even if there was an innocent explanation for everything, neither of us felt comfortable staying in an isolated area after finding buried belongings and signs of recent human activity. We began breaking down the campsite as quickly as possible, using flashlights while darkness settled over the forest surrounding the lake. While we packed the tent, I continued glancing occasionally toward the opposite shoreline. At some point, I noticed that the glow of the cigarette had disappeared. That should have made me feel better, but it had the opposite effect. Now I had no idea whether the person had left or simply moved somewhere less visible. The sense of urgency increased immediately. We packed our equipment in record time and loaded everything into the car. Scout remained extremely alert throughout the entire process. Several times he stopped what he was doing and stared into the woods near the campsite. Just before leaving, I decided to shine my flashlight toward the hole one final time. That was when I noticed something that made me get into the car without a second thought. The footprints we had seen earlier now appeared to continue beyond the excavation site, leading toward the lake. I did not try to examine them more closely. I did not try to determine where they went. I simply shut the vehicle door and we left. During the drive out of the campground, neither of us spoke very much. We were both thinking the exact same thing. The next morning after we were back home, I contacted the managers of the reserve and reported everything we had found. They requested detailed information about the campsite location and stated that they would send staff members to inspect the area. We never received a complete explanation regarding the buried items. A few weeks later, a representative from the park contacted us only to inform us that the objects had been collected and turned over to local authorities for examination. No further details were provided. Perhaps there is a perfectly ordinary explanation for everything. Perhaps the items had been hidden by someone without any criminal intent. But there is one specific memory from that night that still bothers me. It was not the buried wallet or the keys. It was the figure smoking on the other side of the lake. Because looking back, I have the feeling that person was already watching that area before Scout ever started digging. And the more I think about it, the more I wonder whether they were watching the lake or waiting to see who would find those items first. Story 6. My name is Claire. I am 35 years old and work as a veterinarian specializing in large animals in northern Arkansas. For much of my career, I responded to emergencies on farms and rural properties scattered across extremely isolated regions. It was not uncommon to receive calls during the night to help injured horses, cows having difficulty giving birth, or other problems that could not wait until morning. Because of these frequent trips, I often brought along my border collie named Finn. He was extremely intelligent, accustomed to long car rides, and normally accompanied me without any problems. This happened in the fall of 2022. I was finishing some reports at the clinic when I received a call shortly before 8 o'clock at night. A man reported an emergency involving a horse on a rural property and sounded very concerned. The phone signal was poor and the conversation was brief. Even so, he managed to give me an address and asked me to come as quickly as possible. Shortly afterward, I loaded my equipment into the truck and started the drive. Most of the trip was uneventful. The sky was already dark and there were very few lights besides the small towns I passed along the way. As I followed the GPS directions, the roads became increasingly narrow and isolated. That was not unusual in that area, so I was not concerned. About an hour later, the GPS directed me onto a long dirt road surrounded by trees and empty fields. I continued slowly for several minutes until I reached the end of the road. That was when something started to feel wrong. I expected to find an active farm, fences, stables, or at least some sign of activity related to the animal that supposedly needed help. Instead, I found an old house that appeared abandoned. Some of the windows were boarded up. The paint was peeling. No lights were on. There was also an aging barn a short distance behind the residence. The entire property looked as though it had been unoccupied for years. I slowed down and parked near the entrance of the property. The first thing I noticed was Finn's behavior. Normally, whenever I stopped at a farm, he became excited to get out of the vehicle. Many times I actually had to tell him to wait before opening the door. That night, the exact opposite happened. As soon as I turned off the engine, I noticed that he remained completely still in the passenger seat. His ears were upright and his eyes were fixed on a specific point behind the barn. I called his name and reached for his leash. Finn did not even attempt to move. I continued watching the direction he was staring toward, and then I saw a pickup truck parked partially hidden behind the structure. That surprised me because at first glance I had not noticed any vehicles on the property. The truck was dark with no headlights and no visible signs of activity around it. Even so, its mere presence contradicted the abandoned appearance of the place. If there was a vehicle there, there was probably someone nearby. I tried to convince myself that maybe the house looked worse than it actually was. Still, Finn's reluctance to leave the truck began to make me uncomfortable. I picked up my phone to call back the number that had requested the emergency visit. The signal in that area was extremely weak, and the call took several seconds just to attempt connecting. While I waited, I continued watching the pickup truck. That was when I noticed something moving inside it. At first, I thought it was simply a reflection from the dashboard or some illusion caused by the darkness. But a few seconds later, I clearly saw a shadow shifting position behind the windshield. My heart immediately started racing. Someone was sitting inside. Before I could decide what to do, the driver's door slowly opened. It was not thrown open suddenly, nor did it look like someone rushing to ask for help. The door simply opened slowly. An adult figure stepped out of the vehicle and remained standing beside it for a few seconds. The distance and lack of lighting prevented me from seeing facial details. What caught my attention was that the person seemed to be looking directly at me. Then they began walking toward the truck where I was parked. They did not wave. They did not call my name. They did not make any gesture indicating they needed help with an injured horse. They simply started approaching slowly, as if they already knew exactly who would arrive there that night. At that moment, every instinct I had told me not to leave the vehicle. The call still had not connected, and the man continued approaching without showing any sense of urgency. That did not match someone who supposedly had a horse in an emergency situation. In real emergencies, owners usually run to the vehicle, quickly explain the problem, and try to lead me to the animal as fast as possible. That man did none of those things. Finn also remained motionless, watching his every movement. I had never seen my dog behave that way. The fur along his back was slightly raised, and he kept his eyes fixed on the figure moving across the property. Finally, the call attempted to connect but immediately dropped because of the weak signal. As I stared at the screen in frustration, the man had already crossed much of the distance between us. That was when I noticed another strange detail. He was not carrying a flashlight. He was not carrying tools. He did not appear to be coming from a stable or any area where animals would normally be kept. He was simply walking from the pickup truck parked behind the barn. I made a quick decision and started the engine. The sound of the truck immediately seemed to catch his attention. The man stopped walking for a few seconds. Even from that distance, I had the impression that he was evaluating what I would do next. I shifted into reverse without taking my eyes off him. That was when something even stranger happened. Another shadow appeared near the barn, then a second one. I could not determine exactly how many people were there because of the darkness, but it became clear that the man was not alone on the property. The feeling of danger increased instantly. I continued backing down the dirt road while trying to keep the truck aligned. The man who had exited the vehicle remained standing and watching. None of the figures ran after me. None of them attempted to block the exit. That almost frightened me more. They seemed perfectly calm, as though they expected me to make exactly that decision. As I gained distance, the outlines of the house, the barn, and the people gradually disappeared into the darkness behind me. I continued driving down the dirt road without slowing down until I regained enough cell service to make calls. As soon as that happened, I stopped in a more open area and called the number that had requested the emergency visit again. This time the call connected. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. No identification message mentioned a farm, rural property, or anything related to animals. I hung up and tried again. The result was the same. Next, I called a fellow veterinarian who worked in the same region and asked if she knew the address I had been given. Her answer made me even more uncomfortable. According to what she remembered, that property had been abandoned for quite some time and did not have any regular livestock operations. That information did not prove anything by itself, but it fit perfectly with what I had just seen. A few minutes later, I contacted the county sheriff's office and reported the entire situation. I explained the phone call, the abandoned house, the people on the property, and the fact that there was no visible veterinary emergency at the location. 2 days later, I received a follow-up call from a deputy who had participated in checking the property. According to him, the officers found signs of recent activity there, including vehicles parked near the barn. However, when they arrived, nobody was found. There were also no horses or other animals in need of treatment. The number used to request my presence was a prepaid phone that did not allow them to clearly identify who was responsible. To this day, I do not know why I was called to that property that night. Perhaps there was a simple explanation that I never discovered. Perhaps I interrupted some activity that they did not want a witness to see. But there is one specific detail that keeps coming back to me whenever I think about that experience. It was not the abandoned house, nor the figures appearing near the barn. It was Finn's reaction. My dog normally loved accompanying me on farm visits and was always the first to want to leave the vehicle. That night, before I noticed anything unusual at all, he was already staring at the pickup truck hidden behind the barn and refusing to get out. And looking back, I have the feeling that he realized something was wrong long before I understood that there had never been any emergency at that place.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.